I held that envelope in my shaking hands, knowing that whatever was inside would either save my marriage or destroy everything I thought I knew about the man I'd loved for 8 years. What I discovered didn't just change my life. It shattered the very foundation of who I thought I was. My name is Sarah, and 8 years ago I thought I had won the lottery of love. I was 24, fresh out of college with a degree in marketing, working at a small firm in downtown Portland. When I met Marcus at a mutual friend's birthday party, wasn't the loudest guy in the room or the most conventionally handsome.
Well, what?
But there was something about the way he listened, really listened. When people spoke that drew me in like a magnet. Marcus was 26, a software engineer with kind brown eyes and this laugh that could fill up an entire room. He had grown up in a tight-knit Puerto Rican family in Chicago. The stories he told about his childhood, helping his abuela make empanadas every Sunday. Playing baseball with his 3 older brothers in the tiny backyard of their family home painted this picture of warmth and tradition that I desperately wanted to be part of. You see, my own childhood had been pretty different. I was an only child raised by a single mom who worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. We moved apartments 6 times before I turned 16, always chasing cheaper rent or running from landlords we couldn't pay. Family gatherings for us meant Chinese takeout on Christmas, because Mom had to work at the hospital where she cleaned floors. Don't get me wrong, I loved my mother fiercely, and I understood the sacrifices she made. But Marcus's stories of this big, loving, chaotic family felt like something out of a movie I'd always wanted to star in. When Marcus took me home to meet his family after we'd been dating for 4 months, I felt like I was stepping into that movie. His mother, Alina, immediately wrapped me in a hug that lasted so long I thought she might never let go. His father, Roberto, showed me his prized tomato garden and taught me the secret to his famous salsa verde, winking as he whispered the ingredients like he was sharing state secrets. His brothers teased me relentlessly, but in that loving way that let me know I was already being folded into their circle. We moved in together after 6 months. A cute little 1-bedroom apartment with exposed brick walls and windows that overlooked the Willamette River. Marcus would wake up early to make me coffee before work, always remembering exactly how I liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of vanilla. Creamer served in the chipped blue mug I'd bought at a thrift store on our 3rd date. He'd leave little notes in my lunch bag, silly drawings of cats wearing ties or motivational quotes. Written in his terrible handwriting that always made me smile during stressful workdays, by our 2nd year together, we were talking about marriage. Marcus had this way of bringing it up casually, like when we'd be watching couples on TV or walking past jewelry stores. "What kind of ring do you think you'd want?" he'd ask. "Or do you think you'd want a big wedding or something small?" These conversations always filled me with this warm, floating feeling like I was exactly where I was supposed to be in life. We got engaged on a rainy Tuesday in October, not during some elaborate proposal I could post on social media, but while we were making dinner together in our tiny kitchen. I was stirring pasta sauce when Marcus suddenly got down on one knee, right there between the stove and the refrigerator, holding a simple but beautiful solitaire ring he'd been hiding in his sock drawer for 3 months. "Sarah," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "you make everything better. You make me better. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he could even finish the question, sauce-covered wooden spoon still in my hand. The wedding planning was a whirlwind of tasting cakes with Alina, who insisted on trying every bakery within a 30-mile radius. And Roberto teaching Marcus and me to dance salsa in their living room for our first dance. My mom cried happy tears for the first time I could remember, and even helped Alina string lights for the reception decorations. It felt like 2 families, mine small but mighty, his large and boisterous, coming together to create something beautiful.
Ow!
Our wedding day was perfect in all the imperfect ways that matter. It rained during the ceremony, so we had to move everything inside the community center at the last minute. The DJ accidentally played the wrong song for our first dance, but we laughed and danced anyway. Marcus's youngest brother gave a speech so funny and heartfelt that there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Alina and my mom slow danced together during the last song of the night, and I knew I had found not just a husband, but a real family. We honeymooned in Puerto Rico, staying with Marcus's extended family in San Juan. I learned to make mofongo from his great-aunt Carmen, tried to surf, and failed spectacularly, and fell in love all over again watching Marcus speak Spanish with his cousins, seeing him in this element where his heritage came alive. I remember lying on the beach one evening, my head on his chest, listening to him tell stories about his grandfather who had died when he was 12. "I want our kids to know these stories," he said softly. "I want them to feel connected to all of this." I pressed closer to him and whispered, "Me too." When we got home, we started trying for a baby almost immediately. We were both 27, financially stable, and so ready to start the next chapter of our lives. Those months of trying were filled with hope and excitement. With Marcus downloading pregnancy apps and me researching baby names and nursery themes, we turned the spare room that had been his home office into a potential nursery, painting the walls a soft sage green that would work for either a boy or a girl. And that's where the story really begins. With hope, with love, with a future that seemed as solid and certain as the ground beneath our feet. If only I had known that sometimes the ground itself isn't what you think it is. The pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines on a sunny Thursday morning in March. I stared at it for a full minute, my heart hammering against my ribs before I started crying, happy tears that turned into ugly, joyful sobs. Marcus was already at work, so I spent the entire day planning how to tell him. I bought a tiny pair of baby shoes and his favorite beer, then arranged them on the kitchen counter with a note that read, "Daddy's first beer with baby-S first shoes." When he walked through the door that evening and saw the display, he dropped his laptop bag right there in the doorway and swept me up in a hug that lifted my feet off the ground. We both cried and laughed and called his parents, then my mom, then probably half of Portland. Alina screamed so loud through the phone that we had to hold it away from our ears. Roberto started crying, which made Marcus cry even harder, because he'd never seen his father cry before. The pregnancy was textbook perfect. Morning sickness that lasted exactly 12 weeks. A tiny bump that showed up right on schedule. All the right measurements and heartbeats at every doctor's appointment. Marcus came to every single appointment, holding my hand during ultrasounds and asking the doctor questions he'd researched online. He talked to my belly every night, alternating between English and Spanish, telling our baby about his day at work or singing lullabies his mother had sung to him. We found out we were having a boy at 20 weeks and Marcus cried again. These seemed to be becoming a theme. "A son," he kept saying, shaking his head in wonder. "We're having a son." He immediately started making plans, teaching him to play baseball, taking him to Puerto Rico every summer, showing him how to code. Alina started knitting a baby blanket in blue and white, and Roberto began building a crib by hand in their garage, whistling while he worked. Daniel Roberto Martinez, named after both his grandfathers, was born on a snowy December morning after 18 hours of labor. He was perfect, 8 pounds, 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and these impossibly long eyelashes. When the nurse placed him in Marcus's arms, my husband looked down at our son with this expression of pure awe and whispered, "Hola, mijo. I'm your daddy." The first few months were the typical beautiful chaos of new parenthood. Sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, learning Daniel's different cries and what each one meant. Marcus was an incredible father from day one. He'd wake up for the 3 a.m. feedings without complaint, sang to Daniel in Spanish during diaper changes, and could get him to stop crying. When I was at my wit's end, Alina visited almost daily, bringing food and baby clothes and more love than our little apartment could contain. Daniel grew into a happy, chubby baby with bright, curious eyes and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. But as the months passed, I started noticing little things that nagged at the back of my mind like a persistent itch I could unscratch. The first comment came from my coworker Jennifer. When Daniel was about 4 months old, I'd brought him to the office for a quick visit, and she was cooing over him when she said, "Oh my goodness, he's gorgeous. But wow, he doesn't really look like Marcus at all, does he?" She said it with a laugh, the kind of innocent observation people make about babies all the time, but something about it stuck with me. Then my mom mentioned it during one of her visits. We were changing Daniel's diaper when she said, "You know, honey, I keep looking for Marcus in this little face, but I mostly just see you, and maybe ... She paused, studying Daniel's features with a slight frown. "Maybe some of your father. My father. The man who'd left when I was 2 years old, whose name I barely remembered, whose face I knew only from one faded photograph my mother kept hidden in her jewelry box." I'd never even thought about how Daniel might carry genetic traces of that side of my family, the side that was a mystery to me. Marcus's family started making comments too, though they tried to be subtle about it. During Sunday dinner at Alina and Roberto's house, I caught Roberto studying Daniel's face with a puzzled expression. When he noticed me watching, he quickly smiled and bounced Daniel on his knee, but I could see the question marks in his eyes. Alina, never one to keep her thoughts to herself, was more direct. Babies change so much in their first year, she said one afternoon while we were folding Daniel's laundry. But usually you can see the family resemblance by now. Marcus was the spitting image of Roberto at this age. Everyone always said so. She held up one of Daniel's tiny shirts, examining it as if it might hold the answers to her unspoken questions. The comments weren't mean-spirited or accusatory. They were just observations from people who loved us. People who were looking for family resemblances the way families do with new babies. But each comment was like a tiny stone thrown into the calm lake of my confidence, creating ripples that grew wider with time. Marcus seemed unbothered by any of it. If he noticed the comments, he never mentioned them. He was completely devoted to Daniel, constantly taking pictures and videos, proudly showing him off to anyone who would look. But sometimes I caught him studying Daniel's face when he thought no one was watching. And I wondered if he was seeing what everyone else was seeing, or rather what everyone else wasn't seeing. The nagging feeling grew stronger when Daniel turned 6 months old. By then, he had developed distinct features that were undeniably beautiful but undeniably ... different. His eyes were a striking hazel-green color that neither Marcus nor I had. His hair, while dark like Marcus's, had a slight wave to it that was unlike either of our textures. His skin tone was lighter than Marcus's, but darker than mine, landing somewhere in between that didn't quite match either parent. People started asking more direct questions. Where does he get those gorgeous eyes? Became a regular refrain from strangers in grocery stores and at the park. Marcus would always answer proudly, "Isn't he beautiful?" "I don't know." Maybe from a grandparent, but I could see the questions multiplying in his mind too. The breaking point came at Daniel's first birthday party. We'd invited both families. The living room was full of laughter and wrapping paper, and the sound of a dozen conversations happening at once. Alina was taking pictures of Daniel in his high chair, covered in chocolate cake. When Marcus's brother Miguel made a comment that cut through all the background noise like a knife through butter. "Seriously though," Miguel said, looking directly at Marcus with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, "are you sure this kid is yours? Because I'm not seeing any Martinez genes in this little guy?" The room went quiet. It's not completely silent, but quiet enough that several conversations stopped mid-sentence. Quiet enough that everyone heard Miguel's words hanging in the air like a challenge. Marcus forced a laugh, but I could see the muscle in his jaw twitching the way it did when he was trying to control his temper. "Of course he's mine," he said, his voice tight. "He's my son." But the seed had been planted, watered by months of innocent comments and well-meaning observations. And once planted, that seed of doubt began to grow with a life of its own. The weeks following Daniel's birthday party felt like walking through a minefield of unspoken tension. Marcus and I moved around each other carefully, both of us pretending that Miguel's comment hadn't landed like a bomb in the middle of our living room. Both of us pretending we weren't studying Daniel's face a little too intently during diaper changes and bath time. But pretending can only last so long. When doubt starts eating away at the foundation of your life, like termites in the walls of a house, you can ignore the small sounds for a while. Tell yourself it's just the house settling, but eventually the damage becomes too obvious to deny. It started with little changes in Marcus's behavior that I tried to convince myself I was imagining. He became quieter during Daniel's bedtime routine, still going through all the motions of singing lullabies and reading stories, but with a distracted quality that hadn't been there before. He stopped taking as many pictures, stopped posting videos of Daniel's milestones on social media with the same enthusiastic captions he used to write. The worst part was how he started looking at me. Not with suspicion exactly, but with this careful study. Like he was trying to solve a puzzle and I was somehow part of the equation. I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. And there was something in his expression that made my stomach twist into knots. 3 weeks after the party, we were putting Daniel to bed when Marcus finally broke the silence that had been growing between us like a wall. "Sarah," he said quietly, settling Daniel into his crib and pulling the blue blanket Alina had knitted up to his chin. "Can I ask you something?" The tone of his voice made my blood turn cold.
Is.
This wasn't the voice he used to ask if I wanted takeout for dinner, or whether we should watch Netflix. This was serious, careful, loaded with meaning. "Of course," I said, though my throat felt tight. He turned to face me in the dim nursery, the nightlight casting soft shadows across his face. Is there anything you need to tell me? About Daniel? About—" He paused, struggling with the words. "About anything?" The question hit me like a physical blow. My husband, my devoted, loving husband who had held my hand through 18 hours of labor, who had cried when Daniel took his first steps, who sang to our son in Spanish every night, was asking if I had cheated on him. The realization was so devastating that I actually stumbled backward, catching myself against the nursery doorframe. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice cracking.
Ow.
"Can you even ask me that?" But his face crumpled immediately, and I could see that asking the question had hurt him as much as it had hurt me. "I don't want to ask," he said, his voice breaking. "God, Sarah, I don't want to ask. But people keep saying things. And Daniel, ... he doesn't." He gestured helplessly toward the crib where our son was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that his parents' marriage was fracturing around him. "He doesn't look like you," I finished for him, and Marcus nodded miserably. We stood there in the darkened nursery, both of us crying silently, both of us trapped in a nightmare that neither of us knew how to wake up from. I wanted to be angry at him for doubting me, for letting other people's comments poison his mind against the woman who had never given him a single reason not to trust her. I also understood that the doubt was unreally his choice. It had been planted and watered by months of well-meaning observations from people who loved us. "I have never cheated on you," I said finally, my voice steady, despite the tears streaming down my face. "Not once, not ever, not even close. Daniel is your son, Marcus. Is our son." Marcus nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I know," he said. "In my heart, I know that, but my head won't stop asking questions." That's when I knew what we had to do, even though the thought of it terrified me. "Then let's get answers," I said. "Let's do a paternity test." The words seemed to echo in the small nursery, final and irrevocable. Marcus looked at me with surprise, then relief, then fear, cycling through emotions so quickly I could barely keep track. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Because once we know, ... Once we know, we'll know," I said firmly. "And this will be over. The doubt, the questions. It's the way you've been looking at me like I'm a stranger. All of it will be over the next day." I called our pediatrician's office and asked about DNA testing options. The nurse's voice was carefully neutral as she explained the process. Cheek swabs from both Marcus and Daniel, sent to a lab, results in 7 to 10 business days. She didn't ask why we needed the test, and I didn't volunteer the information. But I could hear the slight pause in her voice that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd have fielded this kind of call. We decided to do the test on a Saturday morning, when we wouldn't be distracted by work. Marcus picked up the kit from the lab on Friday afternoon, a small white box containing cotton swabs, collection tubes, and instructions that seemed far too simple for something that would determine the fate of our family. That Friday night, we barely spoke to each other. We went through the motions of dinner, of Daniel's bath time, of watching TV on the couch, but we were both lost in our own thoughts. I kept thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways our life could explode, even though I absolutely knew, that Marcus was Daniela's father. But knowing something in your heart and proving it with science are two different things. And as much as I trusted in the truth, I was also terrified of what would happen if somehow impossibly the test said something different. What if there had been some mistake at the hospital? What if Daniel had been switched with another baby? What if there was some genetic anomaly that made him look different from both of us? The rational part of my mind knew these scenarios were ridiculous, but the part of my mind that had been living with doubt and suspicious glances for months was spinning wild theories and worst-case scenarios. Marcus was clearly going through his own mental torture, kept reaching for Daniel, then pulling back, as if he was afraid to get too attached in case the test results changed everything. But then Daniel would smile at him, or reach for him with those tiny hands, and Marcus would melt completely, scooping our son up and holding him like he never wanted to let go. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching our moods perfectly. We sat at the kitchen table with the DNA kit between us, like it was a bomb that might explode at any moment. "You know," Marcus said, turning one of the cotton swabs over in his hands, No matter what this says, I love him. I love you. That's not going to change. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We both knew that love might not be enough to overcome doubt, that sometimes even the strongest relationships couldn't survive the kind of questions we were asking. After months of living in limbo, of second-guessing every comment and analyzing every facial feature, we had to have concrete answers, so we collected the samples. Quick swabs from inside Marcus's cheek, and the same from Daniel, who thought it was some kind of game and tried to grab the cotton swab with his chubby fingers. We sealed the tubes according to the instructions, filled out the paperwork, and drove to the FedEx office to send everything overnight to the lab. As we watched the clerk scan our package and disappear it into the back room, I felt like we were sending away our old life and waiting for a new one to be delivered in return. The only question was whether that new life would be better or worse than the one we'd been living. 7 to 10 business days had never seemed so long. The waiting period felt like living in suspended animation. Every day stretched endlessly, filled with normal activities that felt anything but normal. I went to work, attended meetings, responded to emails, but it was like watching someone else live my life through a fog of anxiety. Marcus threw himself into a big project at his software company, staying late at the office and coming home exhausted, as if he could outrun his thoughts through sheer busyness. We were both hyper-aware of the calendar, counting down days like prisoners marking time until a parole hearing. Day 3, still no results. Day 5. I checked my email 17 times before noon. Day 7. Marcus started calling the lab's customer service line, only to be told the same thing each time. Results would be available when they were available, and they'd send an email notification. Daniel, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around him, continued being his perfect, happy self. He was 13 months old now, pulling himself up on furniture and taking those wobbly first steps that should have been pure joy to watch. Instead, every milestone felt loaded with unspoken questions. When he clapped his hands together and laughed, I found myself studying the shape of his fingers. When he babbled his baby words, I listened for familiar speech patterns that might hint at genetic connections. It was torture, and I hated myself for letting doubt contaminate these precious moments with my son. But once that seed of uncertainty has been planted in your mind, it grows like a weed, choking out rational thought and replacing it with obsessive analysis of every detail. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning at 11:47 a.m. I was in the middle of a presentation at work when my phone buzzed with the notification, "Your DNA analysis results are ready." The words swam in front of my eyes. I had to excuse myself from the conference room, mumbling something about an emergency phone call. I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at the email for a full minute before I could bring myself to call Marcus. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial his number. "They're ready," I said when he answered, skipping any greeting. There was silence on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. The results. "I'm leaving work now," he said. "Don't open them without me." The drive home was a blur. I kept the email notification open on my phone screen, as if staring at it might give me some preview of what we were about to discover. Part of me wanted to rip off the Band-Aid and check the results immediately, but a larger part was terrified of what I might find and what it would mean for our family. Marcus was already home when I pulled into our driveway, his car parked at an odd angle that suggested he'd been in a hurry. I found him sitting at our kitchen table, laptop open, but he hadn't clicked the link yet. He was just staring at the screen with an expression I'd never seen before. Part terror, part resignation, part desperate hope. "Hi," I said softly, setting my purse down and taking the chair across from him. "Hi," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. We sat there for a moment, two people who had promised to love each other through sickness and health, for better or worse, now facing a moment that would define which of those it was going to be. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked, his finger hovering over the touchpad. I wasn't ready. I don't think anyone could ever be ready for a moment like this. But I nodded anyway, because sometimes you have to jump off the cliff, even when you can't see the bottom. Marcus clicked the link, and we both leaned forward as the page loaded. There was a moment of buffering those spinning circles that felt like they were mocking us. And then the results appeared on the screen in black and white text that could be argued with or interpreted or wished away. Probability of paternity 0.00%. Marcus Martinez is excluded as the biological father of Daniel Martinez. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually gasped and fell back in my chair, my hand flying to my chest as if I'd been shot. This was impossible. This was a mistake. This was some kind of nightmare that I was going to wake up from any second. But Marcus's reaction told me it was real. He made a sound like all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. A horrible, wounded noise that I'd never heard from him before. His face went completely white, then flushed red, then white again. Stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity before slowly, mechanically closing the laptop. "Marcus," I started, but my voice came out as a croak. He stood up from the table so abruptly that his chair fell backward, clattering against the kitchen floor. For a moment I thought he was going to yell, or throw something, or demand an explanation I didn't have. Instead, he just looked at me with the most devastated expression I'd ever seen on another human being's face. "How?" he whispered. "How was this possible?" I was crying now, ugly sobs that made it hard to speak. "I don't know," I managed. "Marcus, I swear to God, I don't know. I never cheated on you. Never. Not once. I don't understand how this is possible." But even as the words left my mouth, I realized how they must sound to him. Here was scientific proof that the child we'd been raising together, the child he'd loved and sang to and stayed up all night with, wasn't biologically his. And I was telling him I had no idea how that could be true. Marcus walked over to the kitchen window and stared out at our backyard, where Daniel's swing set sat empty in the afternoon sun. His shoulders were shaking, and I could tell he was trying not to fall apart completely. "The hospital," I said suddenly, the thought hitting me like lightning. What if there was a mix-up at the hospital? What if Daniel, as in single quotes, I couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't voice the possibility that the child sleeping peacefully in his crib upstairs might not even be mine. Marcus turned around and I could see he'd been thinking the same thing. "We need another test," he said, his voice hollow. "We need to test you too." The second test results arrived 3 days later, and this time I opened them alone while Marcus was at work and Daniel was napping. My hands were steadier this time, maybe because I'd already survived one devastating blow. Or maybe because I was too emotionally numb to feel the fear as acutely. Probability of maternity? 99.99%. Sarah Martinez is not excluded as the biological mother of Daniel Martinez. So Daniel was mine. Definitely, scientifically, unquestionably mine. Which meant that somewhere in the timeline of his conception, something had happened that I genuinely couldn't remember or explain. Something that had resulted in my son having a biological father who wasn't the man I'd been married to. The man I'd never cheated on, the man I loved more than my own life. I sat in our quiet kitchen, staring at the results, trying to solve a puzzle that seemed to have pieces missing. And slowly, like dawn breaking over the darkest night of my life, a terrible possibility began to form in my mind. The realization didn't come all at once like a lightning bolt. It crept in slowly, like water finding cracks in a foundation, until suddenly the whole structure of my understanding collapsed. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the DNA results for the 100th time, when fragments of a memory I'd buried deep started surfacing like debris from a shipwreck. 2 years ago, Marcus's company Christmas party. The fancy hotel downtown with the open bar and the dancing. I'd worn that black dress Marcus loved, the one that made me feel beautiful and confident. We'd been trying to get pregnant for months at that point, and I remember being so hopeful, so happy, so ready for our lives to begin in earnest. I remember dancing with Marcus, laughing at his terrible attempts at the electric slide. I remembered talking to his coworkers and their wives, feeling like I belonged in his professional world. I remembered the champagne. Too much champagne, more than I usually drank. But it was a celebration, and everyone kept buying rounds. What I didn't remember clearly was the end of the night. I'd always assumed Marcus had driven us home, that we'd stumbled into our apartment tipsy and happy and made love the way married couples do after a fun night out. But as I sat there with the DNA results in front of me, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense, I realized there were gaps in my memory from that night, significant gaps. I could recall earlier parts of the evening in vivid detail, but everything after about 10 p.m. was fuzzy, fragmented, wrong somehow. I had flashes of being in a hotel room, but not our hotel room. I remembered feeling confused, disoriented, like I was watching myself from outside my own body. Complete blackness, until I woke up the next morning in our own bed. With a splitting headache and Marcus already up making coffee, acting like everything was completely normal. When Marcus came home from work that day, I was still sitting at the kitchen table, the laptop closed. The DNA results printed out and lying face down beside my untouched cup of coffee. He took one look at my face and knew something had shifted. "Marcus," I said slowly, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "We don't know exactly when. I need you to tell me everything you remember about that night." "Sarah, why are you asking about this now?" "I can't remember how we got home. I can't remember what happened after we left the hotel, and I have these ... fragments, these pieces of memory that don't make sense." When he finally looked up at me, his face was pale and stricken. "You said you felt sick. So I took you up to one of the hotel rooms to lie down for a while, before driving home." The question popped out before I could stop it. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Did you stay with me? I thought you'd be fine. I came back to check on you after about an hour and you were still sleeping, so I..." He buried his face in his hands. "God, Sarah, I'm so sorry." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place now, creating a picture so horrible that I almost couldn't bear to look at it. Who else knew I was in that room? The hotel staff knew I'd gotten a room key. What are you thinking? Someone had known I was alone in that hotel room, vulnerable and unconscious. Someone had taken advantage of that knowledge. Someone had assaulted me while I was too drunk to remember, too incapacitated to consent, too trusting to imagine that such a thing could happen at my husband's company Christmas party. "I think I was raped," I said, the words falling like stones into the quiet kitchen. Marcus made a sound like he was being torn apart. The only way to reconcile the scientific fact that Daniel was Marcus's biological child with the equally true fact that I had never willingly been intimate with another man. I remembered waking up at some point during the night feeling wrong, feeling violated, but being too disoriented to understand what was happening. I remembered my dress being twisted around my body in a way that didn't make sense. I remembered pain and confusion and the overwhelming need to get back to sleep, to make the wrongness go away. Most horrifically, I remembered a voice, not Marcus's voice, whispering things I didn't want to hear, saying my name in a way that made my skin crawl, even in my semi-conscious state. The confrontation came 3 days later when Marcus finally worked up the courage to ask his coworkers about that night. He came home pale and shaking, and I knew before he said a word that my worst fears had been confirmed. "It was Derek," he said, slumping into a chair like all the strength had gone out of his body. "Derek from accounting. Tom saw him going up to the 4th floor around midnight, said he mentioned checking on you. And Lisa from HR said she saw him coming out of the elevator around 2 a.m., looking ... disheveled. Derek, I could barely picture his face. A quiet, unremarkable man in his 40s who worked in the accounting department. Married with 2 kids of his own. "We have to go to the police," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was pointless. 2 years had passed. There was no physical evidence. It would be my fragmented, alcohol-impaired memories against his word. And what jury would believe that I could forget being raped, even if the medical literature was full of cases exactly like mine? Marcus quit his job the next day. He couldn't bear the thought of working in the same building as Derek, of pretending everything was normal, of shaking hands with the man who had destroyed our family. We talked about confronting Derek directly, but what would be the point? He would deny it. We had no proof, and it wouldn't change the fundamental fact that Daniel was his biological son. The weeks that followed were the darkest of my life. Marcus tried to be supportive, tried to separate his feelings about the assault from his feelings about Daniel. But I could see the internal war playing out on his face every time he looked at our son. He still loved Daniel, that was obvious. But there was a new carefulness in his interactions, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. The worst part was that Daniel could sense the change in the family dynamic, even at 13 months old. He became clingy and fussy, reaching for Marcus with desperate little hands, as if he could feel his daddy pulling away and didn't understand why. Watching my son try to reconnect with the only father he'd ever known, while that father struggled with the knowledge of his true parentage, was torture beyond description. Friends and family noticed the change in our family, but we couldn't bring ourselves to tell them the truth. How do you explain to your mother-in-law that her beloved grandson isn't actually her blood relative? How do you tell your own mother that her daughter was sexually assaulted and repressed the memory for 2 years? How do you explain to anyone that your picture-perfect family was built on a foundation of trauma and violation? The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening, 6 months after we de-learned the truth about Daniel's parentage. I was giving him a bath, watching him play with his rubber ducks and splash water everywhere with that pure, infectious joy that only toddlers possess, when he looked up at me with those beautiful hazel green eyes and said, "Mama, where Daddy?" Marcus had been working late again, or at least that's what he told me. I suspected he was just finding reasons to avoid coming home, to avoid the complicated emotions that our house now held. Daniel had been asking for him more and more frequently, sensing his absence even when Marcus was physically present. "Daddy will be home soon, baby," I told him, but the words felt hollow even to me. That night after Daniel was asleep, I sat in our living room and really looked at our life for the first time in months. The house felt like a museum of our former happiness. Wedding photos on the mantle, Daniel's baby pictures scattered on side tables, Marcus's engineering books still stacked beside his favorite chair. But we weren't living anymore. We were just existing, trapped in the wreckage of what we used to be. When Marcus finally came home around 10 p.m., I was waiting for him with a cup of coffee and a conversation that was 2 years overdue. "We can't keep living like this," I said without preamble. He sat down heavily on the couch, looking older than his 31 years, worn down by months of carrying anger and grief he didn't know how to process. "I know," he said quietly, "but I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to look at Daniel and not think about ... about what happened to you, about him." "Derek," I said, speaking the name aloud for the first time in months. "His name is Derek, and what he did to me was horrible, but Daniel didn't choose to exist because of that violence. Is innocent in all of this." Marcus nodded, but I could see the war still raging in his eyes. "I love him," he said, his voice breaking. "God help me. I love that kid more than my own life. But every time I see him, I see the man who hurt you, and I hate myself for it." That's when I knew we needed help. Real, professional help from someone who understood trauma and families and the impossible complexity of our situation. The therapist we started seeing, Dr. Rachel Chen, specialized in sexual assault recovery and family dynamics. She was the first person we'd been able to tell our story to completely, and her reaction wasn't judgment or shock, but gentle understanding and practical guidance. Trauma has a way of fracturing not just individuals, but entire family systems, she told us during one of our first sessions. What happened to Sarah was devastating, but the ripple effects are impacting everyone in this family, including Daniel. The goal isn't to pretend the assault never happened, but to find ways to heal that don't require you to sacrifice your relationship with your son. The healing process was slow and painful and nonlinear. Some days felt like progress. Others felt like we were sliding backward into the pit of despair we'd been living in. Marcus had to work through his own trauma, the helplessness he felt at not being able to protect me, the anger at Derek that had nowhere to go, the complicated grief of loving a child while hating the circumstances of his conception. I had to face the reality of what had happened to me that night, stop minimizing it or making excuses for why I hadn't remembered sooner. Dr. Chen helped me understand that dissociative amnesia is a common response to sexual trauma, that my brain had been protecting me by blocking out memories too painful to process. She also helped me separate Derek's violence from Daniel's existence. They were connected events, but they didn't have to define each other. The breakthrough came about 8 months into therapy. Daniel, now almost 2 years old, had learned to say "I love you," and had started saying it constantly to both Marcus and me. One evening, after a particularly difficult therapy session, Marcus was putting Daniel to bed when our son wrapped his little arms around Marcus's neck and said, "I love you, Daddy." I was standing in the doorway, watching, and I saw something shift in Marcus's face. The careful distance he'd been maintaining, the wall he'd built between himself and Daniel to protect his own heart, crumbled in that instant. He hugged Daniel tight and started crying. Not the bitter tears of anger and loss we'd both shed so many times, but tears of pure love and recognition. "I love you too, mijo," Marcus whispered into Daniel's hair. "You're my son. You'll always be my son." After that night, things began to truly heal. Marcus started playing with Daniel again, reading to him, teaching him words in Spanish the way he had before we knew the truth. We made the decision together to never tell Daniel about his biological parentage, unless some medical emergency required it. As far as our son would ever know, Marcus was his father in every way that mattered. We also made the difficult decision to pursue legal action against Derek, even knowing the challenges we'd face. It took 2 years, but other women came forward with similar stories about him at company events. He was eventually convicted and served 18 months in prison. Not nearly enough time for what he'd taken from us, but at least some measure of justice. Marcus found a new job at a different company, and slowly, carefully, we began rebuilding our life. We moved to a new apartment, one without the ghosts of that terrible Christmas party lurking in every corner. We had good days and bad days, moments of pure happiness mixed with flashes of the old pain, but we learned to hold space for all of it. Daniel is 4 years old now, a bright, funny, loving little boy who calls Marcus Daddy and asks him to fix his broken toys and teach him to ride a bike. He has Derek's eyes and my stubborn streak and Marcus's gentle heart. He is loved fiercely by both of his parents, by his grandparents who never learned the truth, by an extended family who sees only a beautiful child and not the complicated circumstances of his conception. Sometimes people still comment on how Daniel doesn't look like Marcus, but we've learned to smile and change the subject. Genetics are complicated, we say. Kids take after all sorts of relatives. What matters isn't whose DNA created him, but whose love is raising him. The trauma will always be part of our story, but it doesn't define our story. We survived something that could have destroyed us, and we came out the other side as a family, not the same family we were before, but a stronger one, a more intentional one, a family built on choice rather than just biology. Now, when I look at my son, I don't see the man who hurt me. I see the child who taught his daddy that love transcends DNA, who showed us that families are made not just in moments of passion, but in thousands of small daily acts of devotion. I see the little boy who saved our marriage by simply existing, by needing us to be better than our pain. And when I look at Marcus holding Daniel, reading to him, or building block towers, or chasing him around the backyard, I see a man who chose love over biology, hope over trauma, family over genetics. I see the father Daniel deserves, and the husband I fell in love with all those years ago, scarred but not broken, changed but not defeated. Daniel Roberto Martinez may not have Marcus's DNA, but he has something more important. He has Marcus's heart, his commitment, his daily presence in the 1,000 small ways that actually make someone a parent. And that, I've learned, is more than enough. Final line. Now, when Daniel calls Marcus Daddy, I don't hear the echo of violence. I hear the sound of love choosing itself, over and over again, every single day.